Hi, everyone. It is so good to be back for our fall series on Teach the Black Freedom Struggle. Welcome to everyone here on behalf of the Zinn Education Project for our session on Organizing for Voting Rights, Lessons from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. This is our first session in the fall series on the Black Freedom Struggle, and some of you are joining us for the first time, and some have participated in our spring series. It truly is a gift to be able to share this time together, and I thank you for being in virtual community with us. Before I begin my conversation with Dr. Charles Payne, we want to find out who is in the room, and I'll go through our plans for our time together today. We are going to do a quick poll to find out how many teachers, librarians, teacher educators, historians, students, parents, caregivers, and others are in the room with us. Many of you are in multiple roles, but just pick your primary one. As we post the poll, I will introduce myself. My name is Cierra Kaler-Jones, she, her, and I am the Education and New Fellow with Communities for Just Schools Fund and Teaching for Change. I'm also a PhD candidate at the University of Maryland, College Park, studying education. My work explores how Black girls use arts-based practices like movement, music, hair as mechanisms for identity development and resistance. The Zinn Education Project is hosting this session today and offers free downloadable people's history lessons, many that you all have used and many that I have used myself, for middle and high school classrooms from the Zinn Education Project website. We have a new campaign to teach the Black freedom struggle, and this online class that you all are a part of today is offered as part of that campaign. All right, so let's see the poll results. Oh, okay, hopefully everyone can see them. And we have in the room with us today, 54% are educators. We have 8% students, very exciting, 2% primary family member and caregiver, 8% community labor and organizer, 1% librarian, shout out to the librarians, 21% teacher educators, and 6% historians. We are so grateful to all of you for joining us today. Throughout this session, we want you to use the chat box. Post your questions, your comments, resources, and ideas. We will read your questions and our guest speaker will try to respond after breakout groups. If you could put your questions in all caps, that would be really helpful for us as we sift through all of the great resources and all of the knowledge that you will share in the breakout rooms. We will do our best to answer as many questions as we can in the time that we have together. We'll do a short evaluation at the end. Please also continue this conversation on Twitter. We encourage you to share your learnings and your insights using the hashtag #TeachBlackFreedomStruggle. We are now ready to start our conversation. After about 25 minutes, we'll pause so that you can meet each other and talk in small groups to share your thoughts with one another. And so without further ado, I am very honored and privileged to introduce Dr. Charles Payne. Charles M. Payne is the Henry Rutgers Distinguished Professor of African American Studies at Rutgers University Newark and Director of the Joseph Cornwall Center for Metropolitan Research. Go RU. His research and teaching interests include urban education and school reform, social inequality, social change, and modern African American history, particularly the Black freedom struggle. He has written many books, and today we will focus our conversation on his book, I've Got the Light of Freedom, The Organizing Tradition in the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement. All right, so let's dig in. As we get started, Dr. Payne, I would love if you could just give us an intro and just share what the voting rights struggle looked like in its early years in the Deep South.
Okay. Well, first I want to thank you for that intro. Want to thank the entire project. I like the idea of doing something that is connected to Howard Zinn. He was a significant influence in my thinking and my growth, and a significant part of the movement, although I am not sure very many people remember that. And I just want to thank everyone for their interest, right? And in ways that are too obvious to elaborate. The history that we're talking about connects to our current moment in dramatic and sometimes frightening ways. So I am very glad that so many people or taking this moment to look back to that moment and to see what it can help us understand about this moment. All right, so I want to take probably something like maybe 10 minutes if I can do it that way. I apologize in advance for talking very quickly, but I've got a lot of ground I want to cover, and I'm from New Jersey, so I can talk as fast as I want to. You can't do anything about it. 10 minutes, I want to try to make 4 points about the early movement. The word early is slippery, but let's leave it for right now. One, I want to talk about how important the 1940s were. Two, I want to talk about how extraordinarily high the stakes were, right? It's sort of one thing I just feel like hitting hard. It's the price that people paid, right, for change in the South, and who exactly paid that price. Obviously, a part of that question is going to be that women were central, a point which is still not sufficiently appreciated. And finally, I do want to say, and I may not put this in the first 10 minutes, we can come back to it later. I want to emphasize that SNCC was different. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was the movement's left wing. And in some ways, along with CORE, it radicalized everyone else and pushed everyone else further and faster than they wanted to go with respect to voting rights and doggone everything else. Anyway, 1940s. If you were to ask, if you take the number of African Americans registered to vote, which is not the same thing as the number of them actually voting, right? In the South, at the turn of the 20th century, 1900, it's 3%. 1910, still 3% from the best estimates we have. 1920, still 3%. 1940, still 3%. 1947, 12%. 1950, 20% of all African Americans in the Deep South were registered to vote. It's very clear that by that measure, the change, the break with the complete disempowerment of the past comes during the 1940s. And so what's happening in the 1940s? Well, two things we know. One, the Supreme Court decides, 1944, that that Black people could not be excluded from primaries. And in the South, where you only had one party, the Democratic primary wasn't affect the election. So by saying that the Democratic Party was a private entity and Blacks were not members, you effectively disenfranchised the whole race at one fell swoop. Supreme Court in an NAACP suit ruled that to be illegal. At the same time, 1945-46, 1 million Black veterans came back from World War II, and they came back with an attitude, right? As did white veterans, by the way, right? That's a parallel story. They came back with this notion that they were owed something, that they were entitled to have some of that democracy that they had been dying for. So you had a movement across the South of what were often called progressive voter leagues. Progressive was a very popular, even though they weren't necessarily linked. Veterans were active in a great many of them. And if I can successfully share my screen.
Dr. Payne, I can share it for you if you want.
Let me, if I can do it, I can. Can you see this?
Mm-hmm. Yep, we
that
can.
Works? Okay. All right. Then look this way. I'll be skipping around some. I'm not exactly sure what I'm doing here, so we'll keep the confusion on my end. That young skinny man is Medgar Evers, right, in uniform. 1946, first election after he comes home, he puts that uniform on. He gets his buddies. They all put their uniforms on, and they march to the polls, right, at Decatur, Mississippi. They get there and they find armed white men at the polls. They go home, they get their guns, they come back. And fortunately, cooler heads prevailed. Otherwise, there would have been a shootout at the polls that day. But John Dittmer starts his book with this story, right? The symbolic importance of putting those uniforms on and demanding the rights that they had fought for. This next soldier from Cleveland, Mississippi, is Amzie Moore, who was to be just a cathedral. He's foundational to what was going to be happening in Mississippi. Amzie Moore said that being on a troop ship crossing the Mississippi on a troop ship, on a troop ship crossing the Pacific, he learned that there was nothing special about white men, right? That all the mystification that he had about white people growing up in the South, he lost that when he was so close to them. He lost that when he saw them in combat. So let's say 3 or 4 years after he's home, this is either a picture from 1951 or 52, Mound Bayou, Mississippi. If you can see my cursor, that's Amzie Moore in the light colored suit in the center. He's handing out information about how to register to vote. This is, again, Mound Bayou, Mississippi. I think it's actually 1952, right? And just look at the size of that crowd. This is a meeting of the Regional Council of Negro Leadership. But he is, again, another example of one of the veterans who come back to the South and who come back intending to change the South. So that and across the 1940s and for the first couple years of the 1950s, registration numbers move up relatively steadily. By the standards of the Deep South, there's not that much repression, right? People are able to do this without some of the extreme retaliation that's going to become common soon. And what changes it is 1954. It's Brown, right? Brown makes the white South realize that it is being challenged, and all of a sudden, the white South mobilizes against every form of challenge, but perhaps it organized against the fight for the right to vote more than against anything else. That was perhaps the deepest fear. So what it meant from 1954 throughout the rest of the 50s, right, and into the 60s, but I'm going to concentrate for a minute mostly on the 1950s. What it meant to be an activist is that you ran a very strong chance of losing your job. I don't know how to manipulate my screen well enough to do this, but this is 2 Black men trying to register. And the sign that I can't read, I hope you can read, says something like, you should know if you're applying to register to vote that we're going to publish your address in the newspaper for 2 weeks, right? And then after that, 2 weeks after that, we might or might not approve your, what's the purpose of publishing your address? So that every employer in town can know, right, who's been trying to register to vote, and so that white terrorists, right, can know where the people who are trying to register to vote live, right? So it's just so cute. If you had crops in the ground, you were going to find no buyers. If you were sick, no doctor would see you. You could not get insurance. If you had a mortgage, the bank was going to try to foreclose. And then, of course, we cannot overemphasize the sheer, not just the likelihood of violent retaliation, but the fact that the retaliation would not be against you as an activist. Retaliation would be against everybody connected to you, right? As you're by trying to register to vote, you put everyone around you in danger. And I want to illustrate that. Illustrate that in a second. Harriet and Harry T. Moore, NAACP organizers, Central Florida, late 1940s, early 1950s. We still don't know today whether they were killed because of the agitation against police brutality or because of their rapid pushing up of the number of Blacks trying to register to vote. It's clear they were attacked for one or the other, but we don't know. Christmas Eve, 1951, home was bombed. Both of them were killed. Their daughter would have been killed, except she was delayed slightly on the train coming home for the holidays. Their funeral was just a massive turnout of Black activists across Florida, and just turning out for the funerals, of course, is an act of defiance. That also happened and Humphreys County, Belzoni, Mississippi, to the Reverend George Lee, 1955, right in there, right just before Emmett Till, if I'm remembering the dates right. This is he had gotten something like 40 Black people to try to register to vote, to take the application. That's an unheard of number in the Mississippi Delta at the time. And so the Chicago Defender starts off, the Delta's most militant minister, Reverend George Lee, had sworn, despite threats, that he would never withdraw his name from the town's qualified voters list. Then it goes on to say that he was shot one Saturday night in a drive-by as he was driving home. His friend and comrade Gus Quartz said, "Well, I will continue to try to get people to register to vote." He led a march to the election office, and then when everyone else was intimidated and took their names off the voter application rolls, he refused to take his name off those rolls. He was shot, not killed, but he was shot, left Mississippi, lived out the rest of his life in Chicago. Whoops. This, the Medgar Evers story is not from the 50s, right? Although I think he became secretary of the NAACP in 53 or 54, something like that. So everyone expected him to be killed in the 1950s. No one thought that you could keep that job and stay alive. But he is not killed until June 11, 12. He's coming home after an NAACP rally. It wasn't a great rally. He was probably not in the best mood. People hadn't turned up. It was again a rally about getting out to vote. And he comes and he's getting out of his car in that driveway, and a shot rings out, and he's killed by an assassin across the street. Whoops. That's Murley and his brother Charles at the casket. The funeral procession. Dick Gregory said it looked like we had enough people to march on God that day. They were angry. It almost became a riot. It was very difficult for movement leaders. Medgar had a particular kind of respect in Mississippi, and there was just enormously deep anger. Deep anger, abiding anger. Spend a little bit more time. Vernon and Ellie Dahmer, Hattiesburg, Mississippi, southern Mississippi. Dahmer illustrates a lot of the most important points, I think, about the people who sort of stepped out in this period of the movement's history, right? He was well-to-do, right? He was a dairy farmer. He had a grocery store. Wife was a school teacher. Had a sawmill and made a point to hire both Black and white workers in his sawmill, right? In 1953, he sued the sheriff of the Forest County because he wouldn't accept registrations from Black people. But you gotta have a lot of nerve in 1953 Mississippi to be suing the sheriff. It is virtually hilarious. Helped to start the NAACP youth chapter there, partly because the adults were too afraid to take part, and some remarkable young leaders came out of that youth chapter. In the 1960s, when the SNCC kids came, he fed them, he gave them walking around money. They used his vehicles to do their canvassing. He was solidly behind the movement. 1965, the Voting Rights Act passes. He goes on the radio from his grocery store at the first election and tells people, if you are afraid to go downtown and be seen paying your poll tax, come pay it at my store. If you don't have the money to pay the poll tax, tell me that and I will pay the poll tax for you. One night after he had made that announcement, his home was attacked. The grocery was burned. it's not clear why he and his wife for years had taken turns being up at night guarding the house, right? It's just not clear why that night, right? They did not have a guard. They did not have a guard on the house. They were attacked by 14 members of the Ku Klux Klan, it later turned out. The 10-year-old daughter was badly burned. They would all have been burned to death in that house had he not stood in the front of the house having a gun battle with the people who were attacking while his wife and daughter got out of the back. He was badly burned, his lungs were scorched, his face was disfigured. I don't have that picture. He continued from his hospital bed to broadcast about the need to vote. From his hospital bed, people who don't vote are deadbeats on the state. Right? And he never left the hospital. That was his. And if you don't vote, you don't count. That was his. That was one of the things he was famous for saying, right? And so the first point that I guess I want to make is that obviously most college students studying American history will never hear any of those names. Medgar Evers, maybe, right? Although most likely in a glancing way. And so what gets lost in the master narrative, I think, what gets lost in the traditional way of telling American history is the fact that the greatest price for change was paid in many cases by some of the most vulnerable American citizens, some of the poorest citizens who had the least in the way that we normally measure things, right? But if you look at in the years when it's so dangerous, 1950s and at least the first half of the 1960s, who are the people who stepped out, right? I mean, who are the people, given all that was at stake, who are the people who took risk, right? Who stepped out? I just want to make probably 2 points about that. One, they were very land-owning Black people. The woman there is Winsome Hudson from Harmony, Mississippi. She owned about 105 acres. And that 105 acres was used to do everything you can to keep the movement going. She bailed people out of jail. She gave housing to people who were evicted because they tried to register to vote. She created safe space. This man that I skipped, another landowning farmer both of them are from, not only are they landowners, both Hartman Turnbow here and Mrs. Hudson were part of communities of landowning people. All their neighbors, right, would have also been landowning Black farmers. They were among the staunchest. They were among the first to come into the movement. They were among the last to leave, right? And obviously, I think from many of the folk on this call know. And I should say, the point about landowning is probably best put by saying the people who are most likely to stick their necks out were people who had some degree of economic independence, right? So landowning is one example of that. Another would be being a barber, right? Being a beautician, right? In which your income stream is not dependent on white people, or at least it's not directly dependent on white people. On the other side of that, if you were a teacher, white folks directly controlled your salary, right? And so teachers were among those least likely to participate in the movement in this period. Preachers, even though much civil rights, I'm going to say call it historiography, celebrates the central role of the church, it's much more complicated than that. The role that the church played in rural communities is not the role it played in urban communities. And even in urban communities, through the early 1960s, the church was often as likely to be critical of the movement as to be supportive of it. You know, we think of Birmingham as the church-based movement. 1963, at the heart of that movement, less than 15% of the Black churches in Birmingham were participating. That's why you had to get a children's march, because the adults were not there. But to go back, I just wanted to say economic independence is one of the things that predicts who takes a chance at the moment when things are most dangerous. But another is simply gender. And while on this call, I'm sure there can be some folk who have some opinions about it, we don't have any broadly accepted explanation that I know of for the fact that in the rural South, during the years of the greatest violent retaliation, women participate at a much higher rate than men in every form of movement participation, from joining organizations to showing up at mass meetings to going down to register to vote to joining citizenship classes. It doesn't matter what the form of it is. In the middle years, women are, depending on where and when you are, 2, 3, sometimes 4 times more likely to participate than men in those years. If you talk about old folk, no difference, right? The old fellas were out there, folk in their 60s and 70s. If you talk about young people, no difference. Teenagers, people in their 20s. But if you talk about folk in those middle years, right, 30s to 50s or 60s, there is an enormous difference in who participates. And so I'll just talk about just to mention some famous and not famous names. Mrs. Hamer, that is a wonderful quote. If I fall, tell you the truth, to try to register, you run the risk of being killed. But if I fall, I'll fall 5 feet 4 inches forward in the fight for freedom. I'm not backing off. That's pure Mrs. Hamer. Her sort of cut buddy, running buddy, also from Hattiesburg, Mississippi, Victoria Gray Adams. This is at the Atlantic City Convention in 1964. She was just a powerhouse in terms of her ability to influence the movement. Less well known, but one of the most respected people in the movement period was Annelle Ponder in Mississippi as the director of citizenship education, trying to teach people what they had to know in order to pass the test to become a voter. June Johnson, probably in this picture, she looks a little older than 16. When she was 16, she, Annelle Ponder, and Mrs. Hamer were returning from one of Annelle Ponder's classes on citizenship education. They were stopped because the bus they were riding in had too much yellow in it. It broke the law in the eyes of Mississippi. Winona, Mississippi, the cops took them into a jail and spent something like 2 days just beating them on and off. Mrs. Hamer would never walk right again after that. She had a permanent limp, beaten within an inch of their lives. There was a myth at one time that women were more likely to participate because they were less likely to face violent reprisal. That's just not true, right? Just does not add up. Oh, that's Mrs. Hudson again. One of the most influential members of the early voter registration movement is the woman in the middle seated here, Septima Clark, and her niece standing there, Bernice Montgomery. There's a movie coming out about Bernice sometime soon, sometime this fall, by the way. Septima Clark created the citizenship schools, which went across the South, teaching people how to be citizens, how to register to vote. That often meant, as in this picture, you had to teach people how to write first, because so many Southern states had passed literacy requirements before you could vote. And then they sent Black people to schools where you could not learn very much. So Septima Clark plays a powerful role in creating the local army of leaders who are going to be crucial across the South. Like Ella Baker, she had this enormous confidence in the capacity of ordinary people to play leadership roles, right? Ella Baker, I think it's the guiding spirit in SNCC, the source of much of what is intellectually distinct about SNCC. In 1960, when the sit-in starts, she calls the meeting out of which SNCC grows. And I guess central to her philosophy is that while all leadership types are necessary, certain kinds of leadership, top-down, male-driven, charismatic leadership gets overplayed. And it's not that she would say it doesn't have a role. It does have a role. There are times when you need exactly that. But that kind of leadership is stressed so much that we tend to not spend the time developing the leadership capacity of ordinary people. And so that when she says, give light and the people will find a way. On a better quotation from her, I have always thought what is needed is the development of people who are interested not in being leaders as much as in developing leadership in others, right? And so I think a part of what we have to assume is that if SNCC is going into towns with this notion of developing leadership in others, the untapped pool of leadership is going to be largely female. So I think that is a part of why SNCC. But even within SNCC, right, the degree to which women became a part of the movement varied from place to place.
You bring up so many really powerful stories.
And I'll stop there. So you go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say that how you have taken these master narratives and flipped them on their head to think about the rich storytelling and the narratives. And some of the folks that you've shared, like Septima Clark, Miss Ella Baker, I've introduced my students to them through some of the Zinn Education Project mixers and the role plays, and to just see how they embody these women and take on these roles to feel so powerful in themselves and the rich history of organizing. And so you talk about the reminder that social history tends to ignore or forget the influence and the impact of ordinary people. And the tradition of Black activism really emphasizes the long-term leadership of ordinary people. And so for the educators that are on the call, textbooks and the mainstream media often focus on the heroes and the heroines. So what is the impact if we continue to focus on those heroes and those heroines in society and in our classroom?
Yeah, it's a complicated question. When I ask Black students what they get from these stories, as you say, from being introduced to these people, what all students, irrespective of race, come away thinking, well, why didn't I know about Ella Baker? They find her thinking more complicated than, say, Martin Luther King's thinking, right? More intriguing. There's more to wrestle with there, right? Why didn't I know about her? Why didn't I know about Septima Clark, right? And so that's crucial because they're asking the sort of first question, right? If they lied to me about that, what else did they lie to me about, right? So it's absolutely to get them started there. Black students, I'm going to argue this is the single most common remark I've heard from Black students is that I think differently about my ancestors now, right? And I think that tells us something. That tells us that they have kind of absorbed the idea that their ancestors were either shameful or not important, right? Somewhere in that range, right? But we have a very, very ambivalent reaction to the past that we imagine, right? So to that degree, Black folk need to see heroes, right? I mean, they need to see the Vernon Dahmers who are willing to sacrifice everything he could have had, right, for a common goal, right? They need to see Medgar Evers, who's just absolutely adamant, right, that he will not back down, and all of the others. They need those heroes, right? The problem, though, is that too often heroes get raised to that status doing things which from certain value perspectives are problematic things, right? I have the greatest ambivalence about these stories of physical courage and violence, right? Because that's just part of a master narrative about heroes of people who can dominate folk, and you dominate folk with violence, right? And so at the same, when you're lifting this folk up, you're also reinforcing some of the negative trends in the larger culture. So anyway, I just wanted to say that is a hugely important question. And I guess the way I think about it now is that we have to, on the one hand, lift them up, but on the other hand, encourage young people to be critical about the criteria by which heroes are being defined. I'll just leave it there. That we have to be encourage them to be mindful.
I really appreciate that point, and thinking about even asking those critical questions of who gets to be a leader, what are the qualities of leadership, and even thinking about a lot of the literature on leadership doesn't include youth perspectives on what leadership is. Most of the leadership perspectives are white, male, adult leadership theory. So even asking our students, what is a leader and who gets to be a leader? Could really illuminate so much about what leadership could be. And so thinking about what you've shared and thinking about a quote that I've pulled from your work that really sits deeply with me as we have this conversation, and thinking about organizing, how organizing represents another tradition of Black activism, a tradition that places greater emphasis on the long-term development of leadership and ordinary men and women. It is a slower, often less dramatic form of activism in which organizers are pushing other people to make their own decisions, not to look to some external leadership to think for them, decide for them, to fight for them. And I think with that quote, we're going to take a pause here for our breakout rooms, but it also makes me think to one of the questions that I often ask my students, very much in relationship to what you're talking about in demystifying a lot of these master narratives, is who gets to tell history, who gets to hold the pen, and what does it look like when we get to write the history books for ourselves? And so when we come back from the breakout rooms, one of the things that we will dive into a little bit deeper is the current moment and relating the historical context to the contemporary. And we are living in history. So how do we really encourage and allow young people to see themselves as the historians of this moment? And that's what we'll explore. I have a couple of more questions that we want to get through as our time is too quickly coming to a close. And so, Dr. Payne, many of the current textbooks briefly mention the 15th Amendment, the 19th Amendment, and the Voting Rights Act, but treat voting rights as if it was a steady process that just ended in 1965. Additionally, those textbooks don't discuss the organizing in the South, the rich history that you've just shared with us, as an integral piece of the history of voting rights, voter suppression, and voter intimidation. Recent elections have shown age-old voter suppression tactics continuing to appear in pervasive ways, including voter ID laws, voter roll purges, long wait times in predominantly Black and Brown communities, polling places being shut down, and voter intimidation. What must we know and teach to provide the necessary context to understand the ongoing struggle against voter suppression in the United States? What did voter suppression and intimidation tactics look like then, connected to what they look like now?
Sorry, I think I was muted. That's one of the easiest questions to answer. The more things change, the more they stay the same. There's not a whole lot of difference, right? I mean, some of the extreme violence is so far we have not seen, not at a mass scale. Some of the ridiculous things, asking people how many bubbles in a bar of soap, how many seeds in a watermelon, which they used to ask as part of the quality, and that kind of thing is gone. One of the things that I wonder about, and I am not sure about, the traditional ways of disenfranchising Black people also disenfranchise a great many white people. So if you make people pay poll tax and keep poll tax receipts, a lot of white people aren't going to be able to do that. A lot of white people are not going to be able to pass the literacy requirement. There's a sense in which you can argue that many of today's voter suppression tactics are more racially specific even than the tactics of the past, right? That is the attack on mail-in votings, the having observers at certain precincts, putting false drop boxes in certain precincts. All of those are going to be targeted toward particular kinds of racial groups. So if there's a difference that we should wonder about, it's whether or not the degree to which racial groups are targeted if that's even sharper than it used to be in the past. Other than that, it's just variations on the same old themes.
Mm, that is a really great point of how the historical plays a role in the current context. And one of the things that you've also mentioned in some of your writings is that the term civil rights was always a very narrow way to conceptualize the larger struggle. And so why is civil rights a narrow term? What does it exclude?
Everybody but Black people, right? I mean, the movement should be understood as the movement, the long struggle over decades for African-American aspiration, participation, and the society should be understood as a critical part in the shaping and the broadening of American democracy, right? And that means it has impacts on everybody. There are a number of things wrong with the civil rights is only it's a part of what African Americans have wanted. It's only a part, right? So that when you say civil rights, it implies the rights of citizenship. That doesn't say anything about economic equity, right? The 1963 Washington March was a march on Washington for jobs and freedom, right? And the jobs part is typically forgotten. And so it leads to situations in which white people might say, you people have your civil rights. What are you angry about now? You got what the movement asked for, right? But the larger point for me is that the movement, as Bernice Reagan said, was the Bornian struggle, right? The movement was not something that merely affected Blacks in many ways. Irony though it be, some of the primary beneficiaries of the movement are Southern white men who had been impoverished by the racism of the South and who would not have all of those factory jobs in Tennessee and Kentucky if they were still feudal states. The movement had to end that feudal political state before the Sun Belt could be opened up for economic expansion. The last I looked at affirmative action suits, the primary beneficiary of affirmative action suits were educated white women, right? Not people of color, right? What Dick Gregory called the equality society, the demands of Latinx people, the demands of women, the demands of Native Americans are all shaped by, to some degree, affected by the fight for gender identity rights. All of those fights are affected by what we call the civil rights movement, and that language does not imply that. And the leadership, the tactics, the lessons about organizing for many of the movements of the 1960s came directly from the experience of the Black freedom struggle.
Wow. That is really powerful to think about moving the term civil rights and how it might be how it is so broad, right? And so one of the questions that I'm seeing to come up in the chat box is around encouraging folks to vote, especially folks that may feel a sense of stress and worry and anxiety, and also just feeling apathetic to everything that's going on. And so what can we learn from the Mississippi movement broadly to guide us in the continued fight for the ballot today? What lessons from SNCC can we apply? How does the work that SNCC did then connect to today?
Well, I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to stress this issue of the price that people had to pay in order to get us here is that I think it's a way to address that question, right? I think the more clearly we understand what people have gone through previously, the more I think we can look at the obstacles that we have to face and say, well, if they could do that, we can do this, right? I would hope that that is a part of what people, and I know from talking to young people that is a part of what. So simply knowing the history and feeling a sense of respect for the people who made the history, and a sense of obligation, and a sense we waste their sacrifice if we don't act on it, right? And so yes, I am not at all unwilling to, and the young people who are in my life or in my extended family, to do whatever it takes to get them to the polls next month, right? I'm not trying to persuade everybody. If they can't be persuaded, I'm threatening people, right? We're not going to see a more important election than this one in our lives, most of us. It's hard to imagine what could matter more. And so I think we just have to keep hammering that point home, and hammering home the history that has made our lives what it is, and our obligation to those people.
I love that you talk about knowing the history, because I believe that truth telling is a form of love with our students. And so telling the true history and telling the whole history is a way that we express love. And I think that as we do this work, and as we share the history with young people, and getting them to see themselves as the ordinary people that make up these movements is so powerful and life-changing. And so another question that we have here is some of the themes that came out of the Mississippi movement were the ability of older activists to make connections with young people, the importance of developing a new generation of activists, the willingness of rural people to defend themselves, and more. And so can you share with us some examples of these themes?
Ooh, that's quite a bit of tough territory, but I can at least touch on some of them. When I was showing the slides, it was one of Hartman Turnbow, who he too was famous for defending his home and family from attack. And he was one of the many of the people who did that, who said, I wasn't being non-violent. I was just defending myself, right? So that for rural people, by and large, they don't see any contradiction. Non-violence meant don't be aggressive, right? Don't bother people if they don't bother you. But there was never any question about whether or not they felt they had the right to self-defense. Charlie Cobb has written a very important book on that theme. On this issue of generational cooperation, I want to put that in a kind of larger terms. What did we not learn to do in the 1960s, right? I don't think we learned to keep the focus squarely on democratic practice, right? Both in our organizations and in the larger society, right? One, two, I don't think we learned, people from SNCC are always joking about how long their meetings were, right? Meetings went on literally for days sometime, right? Because everybody had to have an opinion. Everybody disagreed with everybody else. I forgot who said SNCC people would argue with a lamppost, but that has been my experience of them, right? So it is very, very difficult to keep democratic practice at the center of the work, right? There are all kinds of things, and Ella Baker was so aware of this, right? Inherent in organizations, and especially large organizations, and especially celebrity-driven organizations, and especially media-dependent organizations, all of those are anti-democratic practices, right? Or tendencies, or sources, right? Keeping democracy at the focus is super difficult. The other thing that's super difficult is to retain a kind of community in which people can disagree respectfully and then move on together as a band of brothers and sisters, a circle of trust in the strongest language, right? How do we learn inside movement organizations to disagree respectfully? And that was a problem in the 60s. And I think it continues to be a problem now. And all I can say is it's a question that we need to be asking ourselves constantly.
So many great notes as you're chatting. I'm just writing notes down for myself that I can include in my classroom, and just thinking about how we move past the master narratives in our teaching, asking the critical questions, examining the leaders that have been typically propped up in the textbook, centering democratic practice at the center of the work, and even including that as part of our pedagogy, right? And retaining classroom communities where people can disagree respectfully, even in this virtual age of creating opportunities for debate. I'm thinking about some of the Zinn Education Project tribunals, right? And engaging and stepping into some of these roles to better understand different folks' perspectives, but also digging deeper into what the master narratives are and how we can refute those master narratives. And then something else that you've shared tonight that is really sticking with me is just teaching the history of resistance and really centering that in our practice, in our pedagogy, teaching the history of resistance as a core piece of teaching the Black freedom struggle.
But yeah, your comments make me think something else that we don't say enough. We should teach the history of resistance, but we should also teach the history of people who opted out, right? When people didn't take part in the movement, why didn't they? How did they explain it, right? Du Bois has this great quote, simply, pessimism is cowardice, right? That if you look across these histories, time and time again, you find people saying that mess is not going to do any good, or today, this vote is not going to do any good. But if we understand both the people who did take part and the people who didn't, and the people who didn't at one point in time, but did at a later point in time, right? And that may give us a fuller understanding of how we can move now.
Absolutely. Very, I have chills thinking about the power of this. And that's part of the larger story of refuting the master narratives, is also thinking about whose voices have not been a part of the story, and why have their voices not been centered in this work, and understanding to have a full, nuance and complex picture of what history truly is, and then what history can be as we get to create the future.